Hello and welcome everybody. Welcome back to Comedian MTG. My name is Ian. We are breaking down today the top 16, actually like 17, 18, of the Boil, which was the largest cEDH event in North America to date. You can also probably tell by the thumbnail of this video that I won this tournament, and we will go into all of that stuff as we break down this video. Remember, while you're watching this video, make sure to hit like and subscribe. Helps out the channel a ton. If you're interested in not only our coaching tier, but also other functions of helping out this channel, check out patreon.com/comedianmtg as well. Helps out the channel so much, helps keeps the lights on, helps me to get to tournaments like this one. So thank you. Without any further ado, let's break down these decks. So as we look down here to the page for this event, you notice that some of the winning records here, the 3, 2, and 2, were actually the cutoff for our players to be able to make the top 16. Unfortunately, we actually had 2 players who made that 3, 2, and 2 performance and lost out in the top 16 due to breakers, due to their opponent's win percentage specifically. So I figured we would cover these decks as well. So today you're getting some extra decks here. We're covering a top 18. This is the kind of stuff that happens when you have a 220 person tournament, right? 222 to be specific. It involves a lot of people pushing for a lot of really big numbers and a lot of tough scores to reach, right? So we have people who just missed the cut, and also one of these decks is one of the coolest decks I've seen in a long time, so I couldn't do this video without covering it, even though they missed the top 16 technically by 0.02%. So let's cover our first of these decks today. We have Jay Stacko here with a Tymna Kraum classic Blue Farm-esque list. It is pretty standard as far as I'm concerned. We have Lavinia Tech here, not always played in Blue Farm, and Time Twister having a secondary wheel in Blue Farm. A lot of folks are just relegating themselves to a single wheel in this list as of the modern versions of this deck. But Jay Stacko here, a name folks should be familiar with in the world of cEDH. They have definitely made some top cuts beforehand and came so very close to doing so here at this very tournament. The interesting stuff for me in this version of Blue Farm is definitely the Curse Totem. I know it is a card that a lot of people have been considering in Blue Farm for quite some time. It's obviously a powerful card, and it shuts down a lot of the creature strategies, which I believe the field was made up of a considerable amount of Blue Farm and Kinan. So if you're expecting the Kinan matchup to be a frequent one in this cEDH tournament, it definitely helps to have a Curse Totem packed into your deck, and a deck like Blue Farm with that extra advantage of Curse Totem can definitely help to outgrind other decks. Now, we will cover a few Blue Farm decks in this tournament, so let me give you the basic breakdown of the Blue Farm for those who don't know. It is a Tymna and Kraum mid-range base deck with some really high explosive potential. The idea is to eventually grind the game out by playing one of your 2 card advantage engines and win the game with a Thassa's Oracle combination with either Demonic Consultation or Tainted Pact. A lot of the deck also tries to resolve an Ad Nauseam, but once again, in much more of a mid-range way. It's not a Turbo Naz deck per se, but Ad Naz is just a great finisher in a list like this. We have Intuition in here to assemble your Underworld Breach piles, one of the main ways to win the deck. Also worth noting that Necropotence is not often seen in Blue Farm, and it's seen every once in a while, but definitely not a standard inclusion, so that's worth shouting out here in this variant. But with the win cons that we just talked about, you are trying to end the game mostly with Breach lines after grinding it out with a number of just very high value Sands green creatures, and once again, those 2 card advantage engines in the command zone. One of the main reasons I wanted to cover the top 18 for this tournament was this deck here, which is so sweet. We have Elock 888 here with Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker. So, I mean, as many of you very clearly know, Kiki Jiki is a card that I truly adore, and the fact that someone was able to take a deck with Kiki Jiki at the helm of the deck and come so close to the top 16 of the largest North American tournament with this amazing deck, I had to cover it. I had to cover it in this video, and I couldn't let it just sit there in the 17th place. There's so many cool inclusions in this deck. Now, for those who don't know, Kiki Jiki is like very well known as like the combo commander in red. However, it's not really been seen at cEDH tables. So there's a number of different combos that can exist with Kiki Jiki. Cards like Port Razor, if you're able to connect with Port Razor and Kiki Jiki, they allow you to go through and do infinite combats. Coercive Recruiter and Zealous Conscripts and Combat Celebrant are also outlets for Kiki as well. The Conscripts and the Recruiter allow them, when you make copies of them, to untap the Kiki itself and therefore make infinite copies because you're making a copy copy of the permanent, untapping, making another copy, and therefore and so on and so on. There's also a number of other combos in this deck. There's a straight up Godo Helm combo in here. They don't have Hammer in here, but I know they were playing Magnetic Theft as well, because I actually played with our Kiki pilot here during the Swiss of our tournament, and they had Godo plus Magnetic Theft ready to almost steal our entire game. But luckily Sisse had some interaction to stop them. Yeah, this deck is just full of a lot of crazy stuff here. It's also like straight up on Underworld Breach lines. There is Breach in this deck, but also like pieces like Roiling Vortex that like are anti-Breach tech too. There's a lot of crazy stuff here, and you don't see like a traditional grinding station thing here with the Breach lines. The Breach is strictly like a value breach, right? So you're actually just trying to cast spells out of your yard over and over again to try and assemble one of the many other combos that we just talked about. There's also Dual Caster Twin Flame lines here with Dual Caster, Twin Flame, and Heat Shimmer, right? If you have one of those and then copy them, Dual Caster makes infinite Dual Caster mages. So this list, I thoroughly recommend someone goes in and just take some time to explore this deck, because it is so cool. I mean, there's so much crazy stuff going on here with this deck, and as a true mono red lover personally, this is such an experience to be able to go check out this deck. And the fact that once again they were able to have this deep run at a huge tournament, and once again the largest tournament in North America, and be able to almost get there with this mono red Kijiki deck is so sick. It's making the inner mono red player in me so happy to see this. Now time to get to our actual top 16. In 16th place here we have Teamer Necro by Manila. Manila is someone who is not unfamiliar with top tables. They have made several deep runs at Mox Masters, including I think winning a few, and they're definitely known for playing this Thrasios Dargo list almost exclusively. This deck is a Thrasios and Dargo mid-range pile. The idea is that Dargo opens up a number of combos from the command zone, namely being able to Neoform into a Tidespout Tyrant, where that way you can blink some of your rocks over and over again. There's also things with like Relic of Legends and Sack Outlets and stuff like that to be able to cast Dargo over and over again. You have lines with Displacer Kitten and Dockside and Eternal Witness and stuff like that to be able to loop through your deck and like lightning bolt people to death. There's Kinan in combination with the Assault Monolith normally, but I guess we don't have that in this version of the deck. I'm actually quite surprised by that. So I guess we just have a value kit in here. One of the things to know also is that Greater Good is a combo with Dargo a lot of the time. When you get 3 sacrifices during your turn, you basically end up in a situation where you only have to pay a single red, and then you're able to cast Dargo and sack it, drawing 7 cards and discarding 3. So for every iteration of red mana you have, you're able to recur that loop, which can be extremely explosive in the correct circumstances. You also have Teamer Sabretooth in combination with Dockside to make infinite mana that way. Pump that into Thrasios, pretty easy outlet right there. The rest of the deck is sort of this like, it's like fast Teamer mid-range, right? It's not exactly super explosive. It's not a Turbo Nas deck or anything like that, but it's a very explosive Breach deck and definitely uses Dargo in the zone to be able to push those wins a little bit faster than other Thrasios lists. It's a small kitten break here. She was yelling at me during my last deck, so I'm taking time to have her here. All right, we have Ots Darva here with You Gotta Be Kidding Me. This is a pretty classic Kinan mid-range list. Some interesting choices here with some of these inclusions that we definitely want to excited to break down. There's going to be Kinan is another name, much like Blue Farm in this tournament, that you are going to be hearing a decent amount of. Once again, I think about Blue Farm took about 13% of the field and Kinan took about 10%. So these were definitely heavily represented decks for this tournament, which makes sense because they're 2 of the best decks in the format, right? In this version, we see some inclusions that are not always seen. This is actually very close to Twang or Jorman's list. Jorman / Twang is a well-known player and someone who performs quite well with this Kinan deck, known for playing Blue Farm in IRL tournaments, which they did in this very tournament, and we'll talk about him later. But his online list, which did very well recently, I believe won an online tournament very recently within the past few weeks, you might recognize a lot of the choices from that deck in this very deck here. We have Soulless Jailer, which is definitely not played in all of the Kinan lists, but it's really good graveyard hate, really good anti-breach tech. Definitely a piece that I want to take a look at in my own Kinan list moving forward. We have the Armor Scrapboard here for this version. We have Aboleth Spawn, which I feel like is mostly a Twang inclusion. Definitely the ability to steal your opponent's out of the battlefield abilities, especially their Docksides, turns out to be pretty huge in a lot of different circumstances. So Spawn definitely can get you a decent amount of value that way. It doesn't always get you the ability to stop the ATBs that are coming against you, but it can definitely help for sure. We also have Clever Impersonator, which isn't played in all of these Kinan lists, but the ability to copy any type of permanent, as long as it's a non-land, is pretty solid. I mean, being able to take a Rhystic Study or a One Ring, or the best creature on the board is a lot of flexibility in one card. This is one of the Kinan lists that does choose to play Trinisphere, which does seem to be on an uptick. I know personally, I was convinced the night before the tournament by Wounded Satellite to play Trinisphere myself for the list, so it's definitely a card on an upward move. No Sylvan Library in this version of the deck. I know some players are very high on it, myself included. Some players are pretty low on it and don't think it really deserves the inclusion. And this is definitely one of the lower 25 land Kinans, which also playing like the Cephalid Coliseum, Crop Rotation, Emergence Zone package, which helps with more instant speed wins in the deck if that is necessary. We have Locky here with the Boyle 2024 127 Rogsai. pretty descriptive entrance here. This is a classic Rogsai list here, up to 25 lands. So one of the more radical Rogsai lists out there, trying to play an extra land in their Rogsai deck. But good to see Rogsai up here at these top tables. I know it's a deck that was very heavily represented at the last tournament at this very venue, which was the Top Deck Expo, but definitely was not represented as much during this specific event. But we did have one Rogsai pilot get up to those top cuts and those top tables. This Rogsai list is very strong, very efficient, one of the fastest decks in the format, and the ability to close the game faster than any other list in the format is kind of exclusive to this one. Misdirection is not a spell I'm often used to seeing in Rogsai. Definitely a pretty interesting inclusion there, but you know, if you're trying to jam your wins pretty early on, it helps to have as much free interaction as possible. No One Ring in this version, definitely a very lean artifact package. I mean, if you look down here at the lands, even though they are down to 25 lands as a deck, they are only at an average mana value of 1.33. So Rogsai decks are definitely very fast and efficient, even able to get away with playing, you know, free spells like Deadly Relic and Misdirection that do cost you 5 mana when they're hit off your Nas. So we have SNC New England Clam Chowder by Upset. So this is actually one of the players I was sharing an Airbnb with for this tournament. It's one of the Massachusetts crew, which if you could not tell by the name New England Clam Chowder, this is a specific variant of Sisay that is really coming out of this Massachusetts group. I know originally it was worked on by people like Mikey of the Cabal, and now the New England crew kind of took this list and has been honing it for the past few months and really doing a lot of work. There was actually another representative playing this deck who just missed top cut in the last round on a win and in. Actually, I believe they had a draw in and they were forced to play it out. So there was almost two variants of this New England Clam Chowder Sisay Boyle version in this top cut. So what makes this Sisay variant a little bit different? This one is actually a lot more close to the idea of like a no bad cards variant of Sisay, with the idea being, yeah, you have some of the classic Sisay combos, but if you notice, there's a single Planeswalker in this list. So this is not the normal Sisay Tutor Chains list that we are used to seeing out there, right? This list is grabbing things like Teferi, it's grabbing things like Derevi and Emil for dockside lines or Derevi lines, but it is not going full in on the completely being able to pull a line out of your command zone list. Instead, this list is playing a lot more of this like 5-color mid-range stuff. I mean, it is an Underworld Breach deck, which I think is pretty illustrative of the differences between this list, right? A lot more of the high card quality, right? Playing things like Bowmasters and Gilded Drake and Grand Abolisher and things like that in the deck, as opposed to the most often known versions of Sisay, once again, which are much more heavy into like the gimmicky part of the legends, right? Not that gimmicky is explicitly bad here by any means, but is just a different style of these decks. And we've been seeing Sisay do very well with our very specific shell of very heavy into the legend theme. But now we are seeing sort of a completely different take of this specific Sisay list. Now, obviously, you have the pretty standard Sisay stuff, as we talked about. Emil plus Dockside makes infinite mana. Emil plus Derevi plus Gaia's Cradle also can make infinite mana there as well. Then you have the ever so classic 5-color good stuff, lines of Demonic Consultation and Tainted Pact plus Arthas's Oracle. So this list definitely has a lot of pivot potential, a lot of ability to do other stuff than what we know Sisay is most commonly doing. And also having access to like multiple Grand Abolisher effects doesn't hurt at all, right? Teferi, Grand Abolisher, and Kutzil. Two of them being very synergistic with our commander, being able to pull it at end step is pretty sick. We also have Meme Bet as another way to be able to rip stuff out of our opponent's graveyards. But it's super cool to see this version of Sisay do well, and obviously really cool to have a number of people who shared the Airbnb with me for this tournament do well in this tournament. As I mentioned, 2 of them actually had the ability to draw into the top 16, but unfortunately were paired up against people who had win-ins. But we had an amazing match and actually did play against Upset in the top 16 and they played super tight, had an amazing round of Magic, and almost stole the game straight up multiple times from me, and it was crazy, absolutely crazy. So big shout out to not only the New England crew for this New England Clam Chowder version of the cEDH, but shout out to Upset for being a great pilot to play against. We have Teamer Morphin by Pablo AMC. This is Thrasios Rograk. Now, I've noticed that in these Atlanta tournaments, this Thrasios Rograk list seems to keep popping up. This is Polyrog, so the ability to polymorph, transmogrify, reality scramble, etc., and be able to turn our Rograks into Hullbreaker Horrors and Tidespout Tyrants and make infinite mana for our Thrasios. That's kind of the base level of this deck. There are other win cons in the list, things like Isochron Scepter and Underworld Breach, but the idea is that when you use one of these polymorph effects on Rograk, it is able to flip and elaborate until you reveal a creature, and the fact that you're only playing 2 creatures in the deck, vis-a-vis Hullbreaker Horror or Tidespout Tyrant, it wins the game. Pretty sick stuff. But yeah, this deck is one of those decks that like disappears for a decent amount of time and then comes back in full force and like makes a top cut in the tournament. I've noticed in this area of the country, the Atlanta area, that a Polyrog list keeps popping up. I'm not sure if it's the same pilot as before. You could probably fact check that in some of my older videos. But Polyrog showing up and doing the thing. It's one of my favorite decks actually, and I haven't played it in quite some time. It was really, really good during like the Stacks era when Winota was in full force and stuff like that, when Rule of Laws were starting to dominate the format. As of right now, it's been just doing fine in the mid-range meta, but really cool to see this list. As I mentioned, it's one of my favorite lists that I don't get to play quite often, so it's really cool to see it do well in this tournament. One of the interesting cards here is Order of Succession, the ability to give your opponents a Rograk and take probably anything better that's on your opponent, either left or right's board state. It's pretty interesting. I'd never heard of a card like that in the deck. I'm always surprised that these lists don't play Bribery. Like we just talked about the number of Kinans that were at this tournament, and to me, it's a great non-creature way to cheat the polymorph system, right? You're able to grab a Hullbreaker Horror or a Tidespout Tyrant out of decks like that. Worst case scenario, you're grabbing like a Dockside out of a Dockside deck, or you're grabbing a Grand Abolisher or something kind of crazy like that. So I always like Bribery in lists like this, but we don't see one of those here in this version. But yeah, a significant portion of this deck is just getting a bunch of resources so that you can hit that polymorph plan or use one of the other pivot lines of ISO Rev, Underworld Breach, etc. Congrats to our pilot for this top 16 with a deck that isn't quite represented a lot in this format. We have Spooky Dookie here with Pant Loser. This is super cool to see a Pant Laza deck make the top 16 of this tournament. Once again, this is a major cEDH tournament, 220 players, so it is not easy to make the top cut of an event like this, and this is a super cool Pant Laza deck. For those who don't know, Pant Laza has an ETB that says whenever it or another dinosaur enters the battlefield, you discover X, where X is that creature's toughness. Do it only once per turn. Now, the reason Pant Laza is a playable cEDH commander is because you're able to flicker Pant Laza or cast Pant Laza infinitely, and the restrictions of doing it only once per turn are tied to the old object of Pant Laza, right? So if you have something like, for example, an Emil Dockside, you're able to flicker your commander over and over again and create discover through your entire deck, right? So anything with 4 or less mana value you can pull onto your battlefield, right? So very easy to assemble a win when you can take everything that costs 4 or less and put it onto your battlefield pretty easily. You have Runic Armiger here as like a value dinosaur, but then you have a ton of combos in this list. We mentioned once again Emil plus Dockside. We have Teamer Sabertooth plus Dockside. Both of those go infinite with our commander. We have Kiki Jiki lines with Felidar Garvian, which I believe are for use of like Birthing Pod, yep, which we see here in this deck. We have a bunch of just like creature pulling out stuff here. Survival of the Fittest is really good at assembling manual Kiki Jiki lines, the same ones that you would see with the Birthing Pod by going like Felidar, Karmic Guide, Kiki Jiki, all that stuff. Then we also have combos here with Dual Caster Mage, and we have Squee here because this is also a food chain deck. So this deck sort of ends up being like Naya turbo combos, right? There's also a Cloudstone Curio here, also for Dockside. So, I mean, we have dozens of different ways to win the game. We have a couple disruptive stacks pieces here, pieces like Dismantler and Mind Sensor and Draenith and stuff like that. We get Grand Abolisher to stop our opponents interacting with us, Kutzil and Ranger Captain, all kind of in that same vein. So definitely not the most interactive deck in the format. There's also Dual Caster Twin Flame lines. I'm not sure if I mentioned that too. But yeah, this deck is just uber packed with combos and ways to protect those combos. And then sometimes they get a few light stacks pieces to disrupt the opponents, but 90% of the deck is just trying to jam Pant Laza as many times as possible in these Naya colors. So it's a really interesting list, and very surprised to see it here in this top cut, but clearly Pilot knows what they're doing, is able to make the top cut with this list. Pretty sick list. I love seeing a Kiki Jiki deck, as we covered already earlier in this episode. So creature combo, Kiki Jiki, cool Naya turbo combo stuff, love it. We have Kitty with the blicky here by the one Chobi. This is a Thrasios Tymna list. Not often quite seen much anymore nowadays. Thrasios Tymna is definitely on the back burner as far as lists doing pretty well, and especially as far as combinations with Tymna. I mean, it used to be such a dominant deck. It used to define what cEDH was, and now we see Thrasios Tymna not quite often. Chobi was another person I played in my top 16 pod, and definitely shows up to a lot of tournaments, does very well in those events, is able to do a number of online events, and was at the Mox Masters Invitational. So definitely a player who's been around for quite some time, and actually think he's been playing cEDH longer than I have. So definitely someone who's been around, doing well in this format for a decent amount of time. Chobi here with this Thrasios Tymna deck. It is very much a mid-range hybrid Thrasios Tymna, definitely a little more aggressive than most Thrasios Tymna lists, right? We are on things like Displacer Kitten and Teferi, we're on things like Kinan plus Basalt Monolith, and you're also on stuff like ad nauseum lines that convert to, I guess, dramatic reversal. Oh, there's a dramatic reversal in here, but no Isochron Scepter. So I guess the dramatic reversal is really just there to be able to untap certain rocks. We saw dramatic reversal from Chobi during one of his matches, so we just assumed that this was an Isochron Scepter Thrasios Tymna as well, but I guess the reversal is just there as a ritual for like post-Nas lines, which is kind of funny. But yeah, this is a very tempo-based Thrasios Tymna list. We have Imposter Mech here for clones, Angel's Grace here, which is a card I keep mentioning on these videos, is seeing more and more play, so definitely a card to keep an eye out for, and try and play around as well, because it is tough to lose to an Angel's Grace when you're like on a Final Fortune turn jamming a Thoracle into something. So definitely one to pay attention to for sure. But yeah, this is a very lean, low to the ground Thras Tymna list. We also have Derevi here. I don't think there's any combos with Derevi, but it's just a solid value option. I know a number of players after the last tournament here in Atlanta were talking about Derevi as a way to not only get cards with Tymna and stuff like that, but also to untap some mana for your Thrasios and to tap down your opponent's land, so that when you do go to combo off, they're sort of relegated to only being able to cast free spells. Be interested to see what happens if you do sort of like a Lavinia Derevi combination where you know they can't cast free spells but then tap them down out of interaction. Kind of an interesting prospect there. I'd be curious to see what a deck like that kind of looks like. Boromir in the same respect. But yeah, very good job, Chobi. Congrats on making the top 16. The world will take you wherever you want to go. Twang is #LTF by Twang. This is Twang, also known as Jorman, one of the better Blue Farm players, one of the better cEDH players that I know in this day of cEDH. Very competent player who's won a number of different tournaments and is here repping Blue Farm once again. You can often see Twang either playing Kinan or Blue Farm. Kinan usually relegated to online tournaments, and Blue Farm being Jorman's in-person deck. They also were able to win the Bonfire with Thrasios File Smasher list, but I think that's the only time I've ever seen him play anything that wasn't Blue Farm or Kinan. So yeah, this is a very solid Blue Farm list here from Twang. We know that Angel's Grace is one of the cards that he is known for playing in Blue Farm that many other Blue Farm pilots don't actually play. I've noticed that Born Upon a Wind is just in like all the Blue Farm lists nowadays. I feel like a lot of players were like sort of humming and hawing about this card as an inclusion for Blue Farm for a really long time, but we're starting to see it as sort of a more universal tool in Blue Farm in these days. No One Ring here for Jorman. We also don't see like Italian, so this list definitely lower on card event engines. We have Containment Priest here as sort of that main deck Kinan hate. I think he was pretty on the pulse, expecting Kinan to be very present at this tournament, and playing Containment Priest as an anti-option there is pretty solid. The only time it ever really comes back to bite you is like if you go to play a off of your own Underworld Breach, if you go to play like a Dockside or something, but that's very rare that actually comes up against Blue Farm as a thing to stop them. Another Necropotence Blue Farm list here, down to 27 lands, so definitely a more aggressive take on Blue Farm here in the format. Yeah, congrats to Twang on this top 16, a player to continuously look out for, as they're definitely one of the best. We have Journey Before Destination by Forcon. Forcon here with a Blue Farm list as well. Not many big differences here from our other pilots. We have no Angel's Grace, so that's worth noting, I guess, at this point. On the same thing, Born Upon a Wind Final Fortune package, Necropotence package here. So I guess this Necro package is just becoming more and more relevant in these Blue Farm lists. I historically had not been used to seeing them, but I guess the new hotness for Blue Farm is to be on Necro, and these lists are apparently doing well enough to make top 16 on these Necro lines, so clearly doing something right. Blue Farm list here, not much different from the other ones that we've seen, but Forcon, being able to make top 16 of this major cEDH tournament is pretty solid. We have Vice Draken Malcolm back here with this Deus Extracanus list. Malcolm Malcolm is always pushing to make this Planeswalker variant of Sisay the best version that he can. He constantly shows up at events, does very well, and continues to push Sisay to its limits, and will always be known for playing some insanely spicy cards. We have Sisay here. We are already starting off with the first permanent in the deck is Invasion of Segovia, which is a card I have not actually seen. People were really hyped on this card, but actually almost never saw it in this list. But the ability on the backside to make your non-creatures have Convoke is actually pretty interesting, and it gives the ability to, at the beginning of your unstep, untap up to 4 target creatures. So sort of like a Seedborn Muse-esque effect out of this invasion, and also the ability to once again convoke a lot of your spells and make them come down pretty cheap. I'd be really curious to hear the thought process behind that inclusion in Sisay specifically. I think the card's actually pretty solid and pretty underplayed as it is, but I'd be curious to hear about. This is one that I was hearing that's a new innovation from this deck, is Gaedrome Dihada, which is one that if y'all have been following the channel for a while, way back I was playing Gigantha Chainveil Sisay, which was like very much a silly meme deck that I brewed, and Gaedrome was in that version of the deck because it could come in and untap your Gigantha, and apparently that's kind of what's been doing for this variant. But apparently the ability to -3 Gaedrome and steal your opponent's permanents came in quite a few times during this tournament. I'd be curious to hear if Malcolm had like a more thorough write-up about why this card was pretty solid in the list, but I know when I talked to him during the course of this tournament, he was very excited about this Gaedrome card for sure. Malcolm's list definitely trying some new stuff here. Twin Shot Sniper, definitely not one that I'm used to in this deck, but an uncounterable way to deal 2 damage to any target. We also have Sudden Shock for that same very reason, so very clearly trying to take out things like Opposition Agent and Bowmasters and stuff like that that could be stopping Sisay from going off. There's a lot of removal in this version of Sisay. Trying things like Aether Vial out, which is a very good way to sneak in your creatures at other points in the game. Shorekai is a brand new one for this deck that's really interesting because it does add those 2 colors to Sisay, as well as provides you card advantage in a way that the deck isn't really used to having, which is just like a traditional engine that you just pump 1 mana into and gives you a little bit of filtering, a little bit of cards, which is something that Sisay tends to struggle with because you're sort of all in on these like streamlined creature / planeswalker combos as opposed to just being like a I draw cards, I cast spells kind of deck. A lot of enchantments in this version of Sisay. We're on Oath of Nissa, we're on Blind Obedience, Touch the Spirit Realm, so and Cultists of the Absolute, which Malcolm was the 4th player in my top 16 pod and definitely got me with Cultist activation as I went to fight his Sisay with a Thorn Mammoth, so definitely ate some Cultist damage for sure in response to that. It's super cool to see Malcolm consistently doing well with this list. It's very clearly like his deck is his passion in cEDH. I finally got to see an Urtai resolve in a cEDH game. He countered, I think he countered one of my Kinan activations with Urtai. I remember Urtai was used against me at some point. I'm still not sold on Urtai, but hey, you know, I think the card's at least very interesting. And obviously, even just having a way to flash into more power for Sisay is a pretty interesting prospect for the deck. But yeah, Urtai is definitely one that I'm one of the few Sisay pilots who is not really sold on this one. Yeah, I mean, this is super cool to see Malcolm continually doing well with this deck and constantly pushing the deck, constantly trying to explore new things. I know a lot of pilots who stick to one deck who just kind of get comfortable and don't really try new stuff, and that is never something I would describe as a habit of Malcolm's. He's always trying to get new stuff going. He's always trying to push this format. So congrats to Malcolm on making the top 16 this tournament and putting up a very impressive run. We have BossMitch here with another Tim Necron blue farm list. A little bit of differences here in this one. This one is on Boromir, which has become more of a popular option. I feel like Freedom Waffle really popularized the Boromir inclusion in these blue farm decks. I think this is one of the first meme bets I've seen in the list, but I could be wrong about that one. No Angel's Grace in this version, and a few more. We have Smothering Tide, this sort of a mana advantage engine, but no One Ring, no Talion, no stuff like that. A lot of interesting inclusions here. And let's go back to the enchantments. There is no Necropotence in this version of the list, so this is, I think, our first blue farm without the Necro lines, as I called out sort of earlier in this episode. This one's also, yeah, it's on Born Upon the Wind and Final Fortune, so definitely seeing the popularization of those inclusions. But congrats to our BossMitch here for top 16. So now we have our player who finished in the Swiss with the best record, but unfortunately lost in the top 16. We have Dragonhorn by, I assume you say that like Dallas, but it's Dala5, with Malcolm Tana, which is quite impressive because this is a deck that kind of just gets dunked on in the current metagame. It is a list that a lot of people have moved away from since the printing of Orcish Bowmasters, and here we have this Teamer Malcolm list back and doing the thing maybe better than ever, right? Doing very solid in this tournament, as I mentioned. We have the new Pirate here in Kitesail Larcenist, which I've seen in even non-Malcolm decks, just putting in a good amount of work. For those who aren't familiar with Teamer Malcolm, the idea is to have your Commander Malcolm out with a Glinthorn Buccaneer, which allows you to set up a loop where you are discarding a card and making 3 treasures, even though the ability only costs 2, and as long as you have an even number of opponents or not a crazy disproportionate amount of life totals, you're able to draw through a good portion of your deck and deal a near infinite amount of damage to your opponents. Shouldn't even say near infinite, but at least a deck's worth of damage to your opponents, which usually ends up killing them, seeing as we only start with 40 life. But yeah, this is classic, creature mid-range stuff here in this list. This is a Niv version of the deck too. You see Magda there to be able to sack 5 treasures, get a Niv onto the battlefield, and then attach a card like a Tandem Lookout or a Curiosity or a Keen Sense onto your Niv, and if it does even a single point of damage, you're able to draw through your deck and ping your opponents to death. We have very low artifact count here in this deck. This is definitely one of the less aggressive Teamer Malcolm lists I've seen in quite some time. There was a period of time where people were doing the full, I'm playing Final Fortune, I'm playing Last Chance, I'm playing Warrior's Oath, I'm playing Daze, like super aggressive versions of this deck, and this feels like a step back to the older versions of these decks, which were much more mid-rangey, much more able to sort of recover, not just go full all-in super early, but at a pace that was slower than decks like Rogsai. We also do have a Dualcaster and Twin Flame line here as a backup if you do lose your Malcolm and aren't able to do the Niv stuff. Congrats to our pilot here for taking a deck that has been really overlooked in the current metagame and has not been doing well in the current metagame and taking it to the top tables of this major cEDH tournament. It's a pretty impressive feat, and once again, ending Swiss with the best record on a deck that was considered kind of unplayable by a lot of players is pretty sick. Before we jump into our top 4 here today, I just want to remind you that we do cEDH coaching here at comedianmtg. It has been the thing that I have pushed to make my full-time career, and I not only want to do well in these tournaments and continue succeeding, but I want to also be able to give folks these skills to be able to do that as well. If you are interested in coaching, either one-on-one sessions where we go over things like deck tech, stuff like that, I have a huge breakdown that I like to send to people when they come inquire. You can find me at comedianmtg@gmail.com. You can find me at Twitter at comedianmtg or on Discord at comedian_mtg. Any of those places, and they are in the description down below this video. As I mentioned, I do end up taking down this entire tournament, the largest tournament in North America, and I know that this is something that I continuously am very proud of. I've had a number of my clients go on to make top results at multiple tournaments, as well as my own personal success. So if you're interested in coaching in any way, feel free to reach out to me at any of those places. Once again, they are pinned in the description of this video if you want to find out more. We have Freedom Waffle back here with his good soup blue farm list. Freedom Waffle, an impressive player, and definitely was a great opponent to go up against in the finals of this tournament. They are here with their Tymna Crom blue farm list. I kind of shouted them out earlier in this video for pioneering the Boromir inclusion in Tymna Crom, and yet we see this version of the deck without the Boromir. This blue farm list is, I think, at this point, relatively standard. No Necropotence lines in this variant of blue farm. You see the inclusion of Smothering Tithe to be able to handle the, once again, grindy mid-range meta. We talked about Born and Final, which we're seeing in this version of the list. Snap, which I don't see in every version of blue farm, but is always pretty interesting. I feel like we have a good amount of interaction here with this blue farm. It feels like a very responsible version of blue farm, and I know whenever I played against Freedom on this list, I see a lot of play patterns involving like playing a card advantage engine and then just playing the interactive person at the table for as long as he needs to before he's able to turn the corner and jam those wins. We had a crazy finals match where he had to Demonic Consultation a majority of his library away and still had a line where he tried to brain freeze me with Mnemonic Betrayal to see if there was a clone, but unfortunately whiffed on that and wasn't able to get there. But a crazy line, an awesome person to play against, and definitely a really cool person in our community. So congrats to Freedom Waffle for making this top 4. So we have a really cool story here. We have Paxton JK with this Sauron the Dark Lord list, which is definitely not a commander we're used to seeing in cEDH. And not only that, but Paxton here was able to make top cut of this tournament, was able to make the finals of this tournament as someone who had never been to a cEDH tournament before. This was actually their first event. So quite an impressive first showing from our pilot here, and with a pretty spicy deck. This is Grixis Sauron, right? So a lot of this list is really just Grixis mid-range stuff, right? It's definitely not like playing super insane cards here. A few synergy pieces with things like Call of the Ring and I believe Soothing of Smeagol that allow you to really trigger your commander multiple times. For those who don't know, Sauron's really, really hard to remove because it has a ward cost that asks you to sack a legendary artifact or a legendary creature, but it also triggers every time that an opponent casts a spell and amasses 1. And when those orc armies deal combat damage to a player, you get to discard your hand and draw 4. I'm really interested to see Hullbreaker Horror in this version of the list because it doesn't really have an outlet with your commander. There's no like ETB with Sauron, and the ring tempting you isn't something that gets triggered by Sauron re-entering. So I'm kind of interested to see that inclusion in this list. We also have Shieldred, which is a very grindy engine for a Grixis deck like this one. I know they sort of pushed for this pretty proactive Grixis approach on Cursed Totem to be able to stop those creature decks like we talked about. Bolas's Citadel along with no ad nauseum in this deck, which is kind of interesting. You're sort of using the top of your library and pushing out some of these larger permanents, which definitely work a little bit better with something like Sauron as opposed to like ad nause when you have, you know, a bunch of 4-drops, 7-drops, and stuff like that in the deck. Sea Devils are an interesting card here. Definitely not one that I expected to see at the Sauron deck. It's a interesting copy spell and definitely a card I'm not used to seeing here. But this deck definitely does the classic, you know, Thassa's Oracle Decon thing, as well as has lines with Underworld Breach in them. So definitely an interesting list. And once again, congrats to our pilot for showing up to the largest tournament in North America and making the top 4 with the first time they were at a cEDH tournament. So it's a pretty impressive run. Congrats to Paxton on that. We have Wounded Satellite here with his Grind Them Into Dust list. This is the list Wounded often makes these top tables with. So, you know, playing against Freedom Waffle and Wounded in this top 4 was an awesome experience. Both players I know personally after doing so many tournaments with them, and players who I have a great deal of respect for. And we see Wounded here with this top 4 Kinan list. It's the same Kinan list that Wounded makes very frequent top cuts with. I know we talked a lot about each of our respective lists before this tournament, and the differences between them definitely actually came up in our finals game, but it's pretty interesting to see these lists here. Wounded, once again, the first person to really start pushing Trinisphere and Kinan as far as people who have taken it to tournaments pretty frequently. I know people like Higher and sort of working with Trinisphere before Wounded adopted it, but I definitely added it to my list before this tournament, and it was a very solid inclusion. So for those Kinan pilots out there, definitely suggest taking a look at 3-ball. Apart from that, we know the sort of classic stuff here with Wounded's list. He's got the progenitor of the Armored Scrapgorger tech. Very interesting stuff there with that card. One that I'm not really sold on, as well as Perplexing Chimera, but they're very interesting cards and obviously pretty solid. Wounded also has the crop rotation lines that we sort of made allusions to earlier in the episode, but definitely focusing on like the ability to win at instant speed by getting an emergence zone and then doing stuff with like Cephalid Coliseum, milling people out and stuff like that. It's definitely not lines that I tend to prefer because I feel like it messes with the mana base a little too much, but obviously it's been pretty solid for Wounded, and I know when we've talked about it, he said he's been pretty happy with those lines as well. So congrats to Wounded on making this top 4. And finally, we have myself on Skin in the Game, the Boyle edition. So this is the update to the list that I won LotusCon with earlier last year. Kinan is my best performing deck of 2023, and seeing as it's the end of January 2024, it's starting off with a bang. I think this deck is super solid, and I really was happy with it during the Swiss. There's a couple cards that definitely will change, and I'll go over that as I break down this list here, but obviously I'm super grateful to have been able to take down the largest tournament in North America. It's really awesome. I'm very happy, and let's talk about this deck here, right? Some of the inclusions that you won't see in some of the other lists. Jin-Gitaxias Core Augur, which has always kind of been like my card in this archetype. Jin-Gitaxias, I think, is finally at the point where I'm just not feeling it's worth playing anymore. In the last tournament I had it in, it was a very dominant card, but I felt like Jin sort of forced me into positions where I had to play more aggressively than I wanted to at the time. Like I was trying to do sort of the mid-range grind thing, and Jin sort of forced me to become the arch enemy really quickly, which is not really what I like doing with Kinan. So that being said, I feel like Jin is probably on its last legs in this tournament. I swapped Coma for Thorn Mammoth. Thorn Mammoth is a tech obviously being adopted by a lot of Kinan players nowadays. I straight up wanted to adopt it earlier into earlier tournaments, but I was having a hard time actually ordering a Thorn Mammoth because I was like when I moved and all of that junk. But anyways, Thorn Mammoth, played it in this tournament. It was awesome. Great card. Very happy with it. Kinan was both doing very, very well for me in this tournament and also very, very poorly. There was several times during the Swiss where I was just whiffing on activations, which meant that the game had to take a lot harder of a line than I was preferring with this deck. But as the top 16 and later rounds of the tournament started, the deck started feeling like it normally does and performing quite well. One of the unique parts, and I guess combos, that came up in the deck was the ability to play Delighted Halfling into Dosen the Falling Leaf. Dosen was definitely my tech for this tournament, and I felt very, very good about it in Kinan. It won me one game during the Swiss, and it definitely was the thing that 100% locked down my finals match. The ability to, because I knew Wounded had a bunch of free interaction, but the first thing I did on my turn was tap Delighted Halfling for uncounterable legendary mana and play Dosen, which then was able to completely lock my opponents out of casting spells during my turn. And so Dosen really, really put in a ton of work during that finals match, which I'm very, very happy about this tech. I'm interested to see how folks react to the deck knowing that Dosen would be in it now, as opposed to during this tournament where, you know, it was like a card that people don't expect in here, right? Like no other Kinan pilots that I was aware of were playing Dosen during this tournament. So I'm interested to see if it becomes like almost worse to have it in the deck moving forward, because people are like, oh no, we can get Dosen at any time, right? So definitely curious to see how this card evolves. But during the tournament, I was insanely happy with the inclusion of this card, and it's one that I will be sleeving up the next time I play this deck. I'm just curious to see once again how folks react to its presence in the list. As I mentioned, I did add Trinisphere to this list after talking with Wounded before the tournament. I thought that Trinisphere was pretty good. I did a bunch of test hands with the deck while swapping out another card I was kind of interested in before the tournament as a tech piece, and every single time I was like going through these test hands, Trinisphere would be the card that completely warped the test hand, and I was like, okay, let me just try this card out, and it did not disappoint. It definitely won me one of my games during the Swiss, and I didn't really see it much after that, just because that's how the draws work sometimes in a 100 card pile. But Trinisphere I was very, very happy with, and I think it's probably going to be staying in the deck for quite some time. Spellstare is another one that I know not a lot of folks play. I've been playing this card more and more in all my decks, and you can see that from my past couple tournament breakdowns. I'm starting to end up in a position where I do not want to not play Spell Snare in a lot of my blue decks. I think 2-drops are the scariest mana value right now in the format, and between Kinan, Dockside, Underworld Breach, Grand Abolisher, etc., 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 Thassa's Oracle, Tainted Pact, like I could go on forever, but mostly like Grand Abolisher, Dockside, and Underworld Breach being the most insane ones by far. This card's really awesome right now. I also am on Miscast. I found that I used to be on Dispel in a lot of my decks, but the flexibility of Miscast and the more tempo aggressive speed of the format means that Miscast downside of being able to be paid for is coming up less than its importance in the early game, in which it can be that like counter a very important sorcery like a Toxic Deluge or like a Demonic Tutor or something like that. Beseech the Mirror, I can go on forever about good sorceries in the format, but yeah, Miscast is definitely coming up more and more as we go through. I feel pretty solid about this core for Kinan. I mean, obviously I was able to win the tournament with it, but I'm feeling really, really good about it. As I mentioned, Jin-Gitaxias is the card that I'm most likely swapping out for it. I'm curious to hear what people have thought about this version of the deck, and yeah, I'm insanely humbled to be able to have won this tournament. I feel really, really happy with my performance in it. I'm very, very excited to continue to play Kinan. It's not going to be the deck I played at every tournament, but I knew that this tournament was a big one, and I knew I wanted to pull out all the stops, and Kinan felt like the deck for me that was going to be able to do that. So I feel very good that I was correct in that assumption. What do y'all think of this top 16 breakdown? Once again, this is the largest tournament we've ever had in North America, and there were some really interesting decks in here. Definitely some heavy representation from decks like Kinan and Blue Farm, but also some crazy spicy decks in here too. Also, we got a top 18, so that was pretty sick. You got 2 free decks in this breakdown for you, so that's pretty cool as well. Let me know what your favorite deck that y'all saw in this breakdown was. Let me know if you guys have any interesting stories about the tournament and stuff like that. Thank you all for watching this video. Remember, if you want to reach out about cEDH coaching, you can find all of that information in the description down below of this video. Make sure to hit that like button and that subscribe button. I promise y'all it helps out the channel so very much, and it's literally just a single click of the button. And also, for those who help out at patreon.com/comedianmtg, you all are so instrumental to how this channel grows and grows, and I can't thank you all enough. As I mentioned in my last video, I am working on restructuring those tiers, but I want to have a really solid plan before I push those out, because I don't want to just promise a bunch of stuff that I can't do, right? So thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Peace.
keep